fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers, we are back to Ohio this episode, and we are glad of it. As you may remember, we are staunch defenders of any place that is easy to spell and is home to a variety of unexplained events. So, as you might imagine, we are rather fond of the Buckeye State. It is home to a veritable embarrassment of riches in mystery form: the Circleville letters, UFO debris at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Loveland frogs, lake monsters, dogmen, and much, much more. Honestly, we'll take whatever Ohio can throw at us. Except maybe that chili served over spaghetti noodles. Although, of course, we respect your rights to your regional cuisine. Don't email us about the chili noodles. Today, we have a story that perhaps you have not heard. One of the state's lesser known, though certainly more fascinating tales. The modern version has gotten mixed up with the ghost villages of Boston Township, Ohio, aka Helltown. Boston Township is an area made up of two villages in Summit County, Ohio, Boston Heights in the north and Peninsula in its central area. There's a fair bit of complexity regarding which bits of land cross over into other areas, which mostly matters because of a major government project that happened in the mid-1970s. According to Cincinnati's City Beat, some areas of North Summit County were overtaken by the National Park Service via eminent domain. Per the Ghost of Ohio website, quote, on December 27, 1974, hundreds of acres of land, including some within the township of Boston, were officially designated a national recreation area. Now, that meant that the government was able to, quote, purchase houses throughout Boston Township and the surrounding area, and the owners were forced to relocate. The result was that, with so many homes purchased and businesses abandoned, demolition took much longer than planned, and what amounted to ghost towns seemed to appear overnight. This began the legend of what the locals call Helltown, a mishmash of legend and rumor surrounding the abandoned areas of Summit County. It was the usual stuff in some ways, especially for the 1970s and 1980s, shadowy satanic rituals, strange creatures, and hauntings at the local cemetery. But when the National Park Service also bought the local dump in 1985 and uncovered a veritable toxic wasteland of chemicals, as Atlas Obscura writes, it began a whole second wave of rumor. Monsters grown huge on the byproducts of toxic sludge, creeping through all the abandoned properties and crawling out toward the still populated areas. Creatures like the Peninsula Python, a snake nicknamed for the still-standing town in central Boston Township. Now, none of the stories solely focused on Helltown seem to bother with that. The fact that Peninsula was not abandoned to eminent domain or swallowed up with frightening tales of toxic waste. Perhaps the name just sounded good, right? Well, no. The truth is, that story just isn't quite right. The tale of the Peninsula Python far predates the annexation of the land in Summit County and the discovery of that toxic waste at the local dump. In fact, it began all the way back in 1944, when, for a summer, the idyllic central region of the township was absolutely gripped by python fever. And it's a story that, in our minds, is more interesting than any 1980s nuclear nightmare. mostly because there's a paper trail, a newspaper trail, that is. And the story can be traced, in this case, to the on-the-ground intelligence of a single man, a larger-than-life reporter named Robert Bordner, who was at the Cleveland Press for decades. He broke the Peninsula Python story back in June of 1944 and was directly involved in much of the action that followed. And boy, did it follow, in reporting that swept the Midwest. And once it was picked up by the AP and the UPI, it snaked its way around a good bit of the nation. Bordner's account even made it to a 1945 issue of The Atlantic, where he wrote of the first sighting of what, by all accounts, was a very alien thing in Summit County, a giant snake. And what is giant in this context? According to the Akron Beacon Journal's modern reporting, by all accounts, the snake seen in 1944 was reported to be between 15 and 18 feet long and was described as resembling a python. Could a python be that long? Sure, and even longer. But being in Ohio, that is a little odder. Really, a lot odder. According to the USGS, quote, native to Africa, Asia, and Australia, many python species have found their way to the United States, thanks to their popularity in the pet trade. However, by way of an intentional or accidental release, one such popular pet snake species, the Burmese python, was introduced to South Florida. But, strangers, that introduction was in the 1980s, not the 1940s. And as you probably know from having seen a map, Florida is a long ways from Ohio. In the Buckeye State, the largest native snake is the rat snake. The state's Department of Natural Resources reports that slithery fellow clocks in at about 4 to 6 feet. So, not a good contender for what was seen in Peninsula. And what was seen there was, well, huge. Delete Me makes it easy, quick, and safe to remove your personal data online at a time when surveillance and data breaches are common enough to make everyone vulnerable. It's easier than ever to find personal information about people online. Having your address, phone number, and family members' names hanging out on the internet can have actual consequences in the real world, and anyone can be affected. I love Delete Me. I've used it for myself and my family for more than 4 years. Working in the public eye, and especially in true crime, privacy is really important to me. I want to reduce the availability of my information, and after a lot of research, I chose Delete Me. It was a very smart decision. So many new data brokers, they pop up all the time. With Delete Me monitoring and removing my information from hundreds of websites, I feel much more secure. No wonder the New York Times Wirecutter has named Delete Me their top pick for data removal services. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me, now at a special discount for our listeners. Get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/strange and use promo code STRANGE at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/strange and enter code STRANGE at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/strange. Code STRANGE.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Robert Bordner wrote in his Atlantic article that he was on his own farm in Peninsula when, quote, he first heard of the giant python which had been terrifying his neighbors, and that the story was, quote, true in every particular. Per the Atlantic, it all began in early June, in the cornfields of one Clarence Mitchell. He said that he'd noticed something off for a few days. Not so much something in the air, but rather in the behavior of his pet dogs, who were skittish around a particular area of his land. He told Bordner, quote, 2-3 days, the dogs was nervous, and finally they wouldn't go over there with me at all. I thought they was acting kind of funny, but I didn't pay it much mind. I don't know what made me look up, but there, about 15 paces away, was the biggest snake I ever see, sliding along easy and slow in plain sight on the bare ground. He was thick as my thigh, right here, and every bit of 15 feet long. More like 18, sort of brownish spotted. I went over and looked at the track. It was like you'd rolled a spare tire across my field. And according to The Atlantic, it wasn't just Clarence Mitchell who'd spotted the giant snake in his cornfield that day. Robert Bordner wrote that another local, Mike Bobasek, was working in another area to the east of the Cuyahoga River, but certainly close enough to see Clarence. In fact, he said, he saw Clarence running across the farm, and he said he saw an enormous snake, quote, come out of the river going east. And just 2 days later, the Lexington Herald-Leader wrote that a Mrs. Roy Vaughn had called the local police chief in what we imagine was a state of distress. She said that she discovered a giant snake in her chicken coop, and that it had, quote, grabbed a full-grown chicken and tried to escape through a wire-woven fence. But the snake was too large to do so. Mrs. Vaughn suspected it was the addition of the chicken, but we have to think that a giant reptile would have trouble with your average chain-link fence. So, she said, quote, he backed up and he went over the top of the 4-foot fence. We don't know exactly how a snake backs up and goes over a fence. Is it a leap? Honestly, we don't want to picture it. But whatever it took, the Herald-Leader reported it caused the python to leave a trail. When police arrived, they took measurements, and they reported the creature, quote, would have been 19 feet long. So, even larger than Clarence Mitchell's estimate. There was some talk of where, exactly, such a snake could have come from. The Akron Beacon-Journal printed a theory floated by some townsfolk, namely that it might have escaped from a traveling circus, though no one could prove that. And honestly, Peninsula had bigger pythons to fry. With this second sighting, the town was in some distress. Years later, a Peninsula resident who was 11 years old that summer recalled to the Plain Dealer, "It was a scary thing for a while. Our parents were afraid to let us go to camp. What if the snake fell out of a tree and fell through the tent?" To which we say, if we were going to be camping and a snake thumped onto our tent from a tree, we would simply never go outside again. Bordner reported in the Atlantic Monthly that locals canceled events, especially those that took them outside, like Community Blackberry Gathering, which had been planned for June. No one wanted to run into a giant python in a bush or along a river, which was very reasonable of them. In fact, they began to discuss what exactly should be done about this snake. By late June, the Coshocton Tribune reported that they'd come upon an answer. Hunters would need to go out and try and capture the beast. The Tribune wrote that, quote, Mayor John Rich announced that several volunteer posses, each in the charge of a policeman, will scour the nearby swamps and hills. Posse members will carry clubs, knives, pitchforks, or similar weapons. The mayor said they were going to try and capture the snake alive, which seemed rather enlightened to us, but made more sense when we read in the Akron Beacon-Journal that the Columbus Zoo, quote, would like to have the reptile, and that if it was indeed 18 feet long, it would be worth $170. That's nearly $3,000 today. Bordner's Atlantic article declared that the zoo was willing to pay up to twice that for the snake's safe delivery. That's one of the reasons that the posses weren't carrying guns. The other, as you might imagine, was that there was less chance of shooting each other. A risk that you know, if you've listened to this show before, is a very real one. Per the Coshocton Tribune, Mayor John Rich explained the best technique for capturing the python to the gathered crowd of posse members. Quote, they should try to slip a sack over the reptile's head and keep him stretched out to his full length so he will be unable to constrict. The article noted that this was decided upon after scientists assured the town leaders that, quote, pythons are non-poisonous. Per the Journal Herald, on June 25th, quote, 100 men and boys scoured the surrounding countryside, beating bushes with clubs and pitchforks. They reportedly discovered at least one snake trail. That was according to Police Chief Huey, but, alas, no actual python was found. The mayor told the papers that, quote, Half a dozen people in Peninsula and surrounding areas had seen that snake, and though no one was able to capture it on the hunt, there was a plan in place. He'd agreed to elect certain citizens as a snake guarding committee. They would be allowed to carry guns in case of a serious python emergency, and hopefully to cut down on any snake vigilante action. By June 28th, though, the posses and committees had turned up nothing. And, the News Journal reported, the mayor decided that a more dramatic decree was in order. The new directive was that the python should be brought in dead, not alive. We're honestly not 100% sure why things had grown so dire so quickly. After all, a giant python is rather alarming, but it had only been accused of swallowing a chicken or three, not ravaging the countryside. Nevertheless, the local barber, Earl Duffy Granyard, who was known to be an extremely skilled hunter, began giving rather chilling interviews to the local media. He told the Akron Beacon-Journal, "I ain't going to monkey around anymore, calling anybody to catch him alive. When I see that snake, I'll kill him then and there." And it seems there was a different kind of pressure at play in Little Peninsula, an inner-town conflict spurred on by outsiders that had set off a serious division. The Python truthers, you might say, versus the Python skeptics. You see, there were accusations as early as June 24th, several weeks after the first report, that the whole thing was a hoax. According to the Akron Beacon-Journal, its origin was laid squarely at the feet of Robert Bordner himself, the journalist who'd first reported on the affair and would eventually take it all the way to the Atlantic, with that subtitle, An Absolutely True Story. According to the journal, quote, suave, sartorially elegant Robert Bordner flatly denied his typewriter and imagination had produced the python. Though, the journal pointed out, quote, he disclosed under questioning that his own editors had accused him of perpetrating the python hoax. In what we imagine was a very offended tone, Bordner told them, "That is definitely not the case. I have examined the tracks out here, and while I won't venture to guess its size, I am convinced there was a snake." But there was a slight issue with that. You see, Bordner was a larger-than-life personality, even back in 1944, and was certainly known for a desire to put his chosen home of Peninsula on the map, and his stories into wide circulation. When he died, 3 decades later, the Akron Beacon-Journal ran an obituary that we feel presents an excellent character study. Quote, he was such a live wire, it wasn't easy to itemize his accomplishments. Bob fostered the Peninsula Python and other folksy stories. He helped establish the python, the Richfield bobcat, a phantom horse, and the Hinckley buzzards in Ohio folklore. We're also told that, quote, he liked lumberjack shirts, French berets or furry caps. His waxed at the ends mustache was a trademark. The Richfield bobcat. A little research tells us that story followed right on the heels of the python and concerned a wildcat similar to a lynx, but regrettably much larger, stalking townships very close to Peninsula. They never caught up with that one, at least not in the size described in Bob's articles. The phantom horse, a ghost horse that tore through the news of 1958, again in Bordner's home county. That seems to have turned out to be a real animal, though a regular old horse that had gotten loose. And the buzzards. They're real and come to roost each year in Hinckley, but it seems that Bordner helped popularize the event so much that it became a rather national affair, so he was a media man through and through. It seems fair to say that he had a flair for exaggeration and for the dramatic. That's clear in the writing of his Atlantic article, which has the breathless pace of an action movie. But could we really chalk up everything to his imagination? After all, there were other sightings, even outside Peninsula. Throughout late June and July, the news came in. The Akron Beacon-Journal reported that in nearby Northfield, a resident, Mrs. Griffin, was outside when she spotted something very strange on the far side of her property. "I saw something that looked like a man in a white shirt, about 80 feet away near the edge of our woods. I blinked my eyes and saw it was a big snake. He reared up over some briars, shoulder high. His throat was white and shiny. And Mrs. Griffin said that her mother had encountered the snake too. And then, when Northfield's mayor gathered up his own posse, lots of posses in Ohio, he said, "We found some tracks where the snake came out of the hollow behind the Griffin place. I have been very skeptical up till now, but after seeing those tracks and talking to those terrified women, well, I'm convinced." And those were hardly the only sightings. Python tracks and the actual beast itself were seen all across Summit County that July, with reports that the snake had even slithered to the neighboring Pike County. But some reporters at the Akron Beacon-Journal, they were still doubtful, despite their own reports on the sightings in Northfield. On July 12th, an anonymous reporter noted regarding Pike County, quote, "No one has actually seen it. There are tracks to be sure, but who knows what someone is riding a bicycle equipped with Jeep tires." We can't help but think that was a little dig at Bordner. Even when the python was sighted as far as Cleveland, some remained unconvinced, and we must say that included a few residents of Peninsula. Because, after all, even with all those sightings and the posses, no snake appeared. And it was even more suspect when, as the plain dealer reported years later, the stories stopped right around the time that Robert Bordner went away to Boston for a year's study at Harvard. To be fair, that was the fall when any self-respecting tropical snake would have hightailed it out of Ohio, or hibernated, or, well, died. Was it one of Bordner's tall tales, then, that had gripped Summit County in its coils? He was not known to fully invent a story from thin air, but had that first sighting from Clarence Mitchell perhaps been of a very large rat snake? And had the reporting simply, well, grown until it crawled across the pages of the Ohio News? Maybe it had. Except for one strange thing. Remember that whole escaped from the circus angle? It seemed pretty ridiculous at first. One of the things that always comes up in this kind of story, except that a researcher actually found proof of just such an escape, of not just one python, but two. According to the Plain Dealer, an Ohio reporter conducted, quote, a year-long investigation in 1945 and found that, quote, 2 snakes had escaped the Cole Brothers Circus when it stopped near Akron early in 1944. They were boa constrictors, not pythons, but we think we can forgive rural Ohio for that one. One, the reporter said, was discovered, deceased, in May of that same year. It was 13 feet long. It was found in Wayne County, which is about 40 miles from Summit County. That's quite a journey, we know, especially for a snake that, per the San Diego Zoo, only travels about 1 mile an hour. The other boa constrictor, an 8-footer, it was never found. This is probably a good time to mention that Akron, where the snakes escaped, is only 2.7 miles from Summit County. That is a much shorter trip for a boa constrictor on the prowl. So, maybe it's true that the Peninsula Python, we'll stick with that name, thank you, it does have a better flow, was exaggerated. But you have to admit, there is some basis for the legend, whether or not the reptile was lengthened through exaggeration or fantastic journalism. It's certain that it did not spring up from the urban legends of abandoned towns and toxic waste dumps of northern Summit County, that's for sure. Although we can't say for certain that the snake didn't slink its way into that mess a few decades later. Now, boa constrictors do live only 20 or 30 years in the wild, but if a chemical spill can create turtles with a proclivity for ninjutsu and a love of pizza, well, why not give a snake a few extra decades to menace rural Ohio? Someone should make a movie about that. We hope you'll join us next time for another premium exclusive episode of One Strange Thing. Oh, and if you wouldn't mind, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on your favorite app. It helps us find more listeners.
At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu. At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.